Yep, that's it, he said. I heard him. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The computer was saying no, but it's decided to say yes. Thanks for coming along, and I hope you're suitably seated, well seated. Okay, great. If those of you that came along to our very first joint presentation, I alluded to this particular presentation about going out and arresting cannibals and black magic makers and all the rest of it. Well, this is it. There's mainly three stories in here that are absolutely true because I was involved with all of them. There's some little bits of historical stuff that I put in to make the story a little bit easier for you to. Hang on, I've just got to change this. Sorry. Right, on with the show. Please take note. Comments in this presentation do not reflect the values or ethos of P&O Cruises. They're personal reminiscences of mine. I take full responsibility for it, and I'm sorry if I upset a few people's beliefs, but this is the way it is and was in Papua New Guinea. Just to put your minds at rest there. Don't come down and stand me on a bonfire and burn me at the end of the chat. Here we've got, first off, in Papua New Guinea, the black magic man, there were mainly men, was called the Sanguma man. There are very, very few practitioners of magic in inverted commas, and we all know that magic doesn't exist. We've been told that by a professional up here on the stage. And in Papua New Guinea, they use magic or Sanguma as an excuse to actually get rid of people that they don't like in a very violent manner. In the Highlands, there's very, very little black magic in the Highlands. But what they've done is they use, in Australia, we used to have the homosexual advances defence, which meant that you could quite easily go up and beat up a homosexual and use that as a defence against the violent crime, because you would say to the judge, I beat him up before he attacked me. Now, that's been wiped out. There's no such thing as the homosexual advances defence. I'm sorry, anymore. And the previous presentation I made, I said that the woman that was found not guilty of murdering her husband because it was she was defending herself against the husband. So that's that one. So under that premise, here we move on to the patrol. I was asked to go out and on another one of these special patrols and find and arrest a Sanguma man. So off we toddled across into the jungle, and we caught the guy, and part of his equipment was a bull roarer. These are Papua New Guinean bull roarers. Most people know what a bull roarer is and how it works. Most of you have seen Crocodile Dundee, I hope. Anyway, in Crocodile Dundee, Mick Dundee goes up onto the top of the escarpment, and he's got this huge bull roarer, and he swings it around his head, and it makes the bull roarer noise, and that's to send a message to the Aboriginal people somewhere that he's around and he wants to meet with them. When Crocodile Dundee first came out, we were living in Darwin, and we went to the movie theatre to watch the first showing of this, and near where we lived was a hostel for Aboriginal women that came in from the islands, the outer islands, to hospital and just for having ongoing treatment. And in the cinema, all but one side of the cinema was just full of these women and kids from Elcho Island and Manangrita, way out east. And then the movie was playing, and then the next thing, Mick Dundee's up there with the bull roarer. And the whole of this audience down here that just burst into anxious cries and wails and everything like that, because the bull roarer was sacred men's business. The women had no idea what made that noise. They heard the noise with ceremony going on, but they had no idea what made the noise. And there we are in high definition cinemascope is Mick Dundee destroying 20,000, 30,000 years of culture in one instant. So this, I'll show you how a bull roarer works. This is the incoming message from BT Telecom or whatever. And he's just about to get into Optus and do the outgoing message. This is in Central Australia. Didn't really happen, folks, just a little bit of levity. This particular bull roarer, and remember that name up the top there, Gorabari? This bull roarer was sold at auction in Europe for €200,000. This particular, it's a little stick about this big. But remember that name because it comes up a little later on. Anyway, I went out, arrested the guy, and he had in his little bag a bull roarer. And also in his bag he had a lump of, it looked like stone, but what it was rosin from a tree that had been struck by lightning. And all this rosin had condensed, and it was all beautiful colors, and really, really lovely piece of wasn't rock, but very hard rosin. And Sangoma men are magicians, you know, sleight of hand and all the rest of it. And Fred would go along to find the Sangoma man and say, I want you to kill Joe, but I don't want anybody to know how it's been done. So Fred would then give half the money to the Sangoma man, and he would say to Fred, you have got to go out and get something really, really personal of Joe's. So Fred would sit in the village and he would watch Joe, and if Joe ducked out behind a tree somewhere, 10 minutes later he'd go around and have a quick look, and sure enough, if Joe had gone to the toilet, he'd pick up a bit of excreta and some leaves, and he'd get that. That belonged to Joe. Or he'd be sitting there watching Joe, and Joe might be biting his fingernails. They didn't have clippers, so they'd bite the fingernails and spit them into the ashes of the fire. So he would go along and go through the ashes later on and find the fingernail. Or they've got fuzzy-wuzzy hair. He'd comb his hair and he'd see some hair fall down and he'd collect that. So the more personal of the person, the stronger this magic was going to be. So if he was watching Joe and he walked past the end of a house or something and bumped that and cut his leg and got some blood on the piece of wood, then he'd duck round and grab that piece of wood with the blood on it. So he'd take up whatever he had was the most powerful personal item of Joe to the Sangoma man, and the Sangoma man would tie on one end of the bull roarer whatever the item was, and he would also attach a tiny little piece of nut. In Papua New Guinea there's a garlic nut, which is really, really significant nut. And he would tie that on there, and then he'd work the bull roarer and put the bull roarer on the table or somewhere flat. And because, again, he was a magician, sleight of hand and everything like that, he was able to sing a song to sing for the spirit of Joe to come to collect his personal item on the end of this bull roarer. And then he would make the bull roarer shake on the table. The guy was mesmerised, obviously, and then he'd sing the song, all the rest of it, and then he'd pick up this piece of rock and he'd go whack on the end of the bull roarer and crush this nut. And he said, that's it, spell's cast, Joe's as good as dead. And Fred would give him the money, or half the money, and away he'd go. So, I said, we all know there's no such thing as magic. What the Sangoma man would do, he would follow Joe around until he was in a suitably isolated place, he'd whack Joe on the head with a bag of sand or some sort of a kosh. But they also, in Papua New Guinea, they've got lots and lots of different plants that they use for killing fish in streams and medicines and all the rest of it. So he might slip him a Mickey Finn, but some way or another he renders Joe unconscious. And then the next step comes along. Now, remember I was telling you about finding the American guy who was going to try and get people to cut down sago palm trees and build airstrips? Well, this is a sago palm. And these spikes are all over the branches of the sago palm. So it'd be a hell of a job to cut all these down to make an airstrip. But what the Sangoma man would do, he would get these long spikes. He had probably a dozen or so in his little string bag of magic stuff. And he'd get these long spikes. And having rendered Joe unconscious, he would dip these one or two of these spikes in a bit of excreta or whatever, and he would push them down behind the clavicle in the shoulders here, push them right into the body. And I miss all the vital organs, but he pushed them right down there, and then he would get a really, really bad stinging nettle, worse than anything you've got in the UK or Australia, and rub the stinging nettle all over the face, head, shoulders, legs, everywhere on the body, and all these blisters would come up. And obviously the hole where these two spikes had gone in behind the clavicle, they would be covered as well. So when Joe eventually regained consciousness, he would say, you know, the Sangoma man's got me. I'm covered with all these wheals and all the rest of it. About 2 or 3 days later, Joe would just collapse from septicemia. And that was it, job done. Fred would go along and give him the rest of the money and he'd pay his bill. The reason, or the way we managed to catch this guy, was that he killed somebody by using heavy-duty copper wire instead of the sago spikes. And we traced back to a building site, and there was this in Madang. We knew who'd worked on it. We'd worked out who was able to get the heavy-duty copper wire, and that's what brought him unstuck, because when the body was taken into Madang Hospital, they just popped him under an X-ray expecting to find these spikes and the like, and they found this, 25 centimetre long pieces of copper stuck right through his clavicle. So he was arrested, charged, and he got 25 years for murder. Now, I also mentioned in a previous presentation about a young boy who was accused of being a Sangoma man. Now, this young lad, he's only 13, and Maboyo came from way up in the mountains, way back. Remember I told you about building an airstrip in the mountains? Well, this is in that area, and this is where Maboyo comes from. So Maboyo and his cousin were sent down to the coast to live and go to school at a Catholic boarding school. So a young Maboyo was out there playing soccer, and he had a really rough tackle with his cousin. And about 45 minutes later, his cousin just fell over dead. And everybody that was there watching it, they thought, oh, he's a Sangoma man. He just put the magic spell on his cousin and killed his cousin. And I had to go out to the Catholic mission, collect the body, for an autopsy and to basically arrest Maboyo, because everybody was accusing him of being the murderer. So I arrested him and brought him back to our place, and he actually lived in a little garden hut that we had in the bottom of our garden in Sidor, and he lived there all the time waiting for his court case. And we had to take him to the Supreme Court. We had to charge him with first-degree murder. We had to do all these other things to take him before a Supreme Court judge, so when the judge found him not guilty of murder, it would tell all the people that he wasn't a Sangoma man and he hadn't deliberately killed his cousin. When we got the body back into Sidor, the doctor came out and he said, oh look, we'll just have a very quick autopsy. He opened up Maboyo's cousin, and Maboyo's cousin's spleen, and then we're talking about a 13-year-old, his spleen was 1.5 times that of an adult's, because they'd come from the mountains down to the coast and they got malaria. And one of the things of malaria is the spleen just expands out of all proportion. And what had happened in the heavy tackle, Maboyo had actually ruptured his cousin's spleen. And it happens a lot with, well, it used to happen a lot with rugby players in Papua New Guinea. So Maboyo, we took him to court, we had the court case, and the judge said, no, it was accidental death, he didn't kill him, and basically he's not a Sangoma man. So when we took Maboyo back to Sidor, we thought, now there's still, in the back of their minds in Papua New Guinea, and they've been doing it for thousands and thousands of years, there's always somebody is going to say he was a Sangoma man. So what we wanted to do was to remove Maboyo as far away from possible danger. So Morag and I paid for him to go to an island off the coast of Madang to learn a trade at a trade college. And so he learnt to solder water tanks, big galvanized iron water tanks, and the solder gaps so that they wouldn't leak. And he actually ended up setting up a big plumbing business eventually. And when we were up in Madang 5 years ago, we found out that he'd only just recently passed away, but he'd actually set up a really good plumbing business. One of the other things I did when I went up to build that airstrip, I got Maboyo's parents together and the cousins. So the two brothers got together with their families, and I sat down with them all and I said, look, we've got to knock this Sangoma on the head. What do we do about it? And the big concern for Maboyo's uncle and aunt was that their son was the person that was going to look after them in their old age. They only had the one son, and he was the one that was supposed to look after them in their old age. Maboyo had lots of other brothers and sisters, so what ended up happening, I negotiated with the two families that Maboyo be adopted by his uncle and aunt and uncle, and Mum and Dad were quite happy with that. It happens quite on a regular basis in Papua New Guinea. So then Maboyo became the surrogate son of the family, and he looked after his cousin's parents into old age. So that's the story of Maboyo and how Sangoma and black magic can get mixed up with real life, basically. Cargo cults. There's a list there of current cargo cults. The top one, they got really, really excited in Vanuatu when Prince Philip announced that he was retiring. And they said, you're retired, you can come out and live with us now and be our leader. Because in their village, all around their village, they've got all photographs of Prince Philip everywhere. They even got together, I mean, we're talking about guys whose normal dress is less than a loincloth. They got together, they collected the money up, there's about 6 or 7 of them all got together, and they actually had an audience with Prince Philip in Buckingham Palace. They all got brand new suits made and everything, and because Prince Philip was their number one leader. But you move on down, there's all these various cults are still operating. That second from the bottom there, I'm quite convinced that there is a cult of celebrity, and that's why Kim Kardashian and her family are making money out of doing absolutely nothing. And then, it's only my opinion, Bitcoin's a bit of a cargo cult as well. But in Papua New Guinea, this gentleman here ran the biggest, longest, most powerful, strongest cargo cult ever. This photograph was taken by me in 1973 at the end of a long patrol. And I came down, remember this map I showed you of the mortar bombs and everything? Well, where X marks the spot, that's Soar village, just outside of Sidor, and that's where Yali lives, or lived. And what happened, Yali was actually a policeman, or village policeman, so he had a bit of status in that area. And at the outbreak of the war, when they set up all the coast watchers and everything else, they needed to get intelligence about how or where they could actually land landing craft, build airstrips and everything else to defeat the Japanese. So Yali was there and he was recruited, and they smuggled Yali off down to Brisbane, to Army Intelligence in Brisbane, to work on that map and other bits and pieces, how best to defeat the Japanese. Well, what happens when you get a guy from Papua New Guinea who is, in Western terms, semi-literate, and you mix him up with a whole pile of other people, white people in particular, Americans and Australians, and they're all soldiers. They're all doing what soldiers do in the city of Brisbane. Well, they took Yali around to various large hangars that they were reconstructing vehicles that they brought over by ship and in boxes, and they were just reconstructing trucks and jeeps and all the rest of it ready to take away. So they showed Yali all this construction work and how this factory worked, and they had bully beef processing machines and all the rest of it. So saying, you help us defeat the Japanese, all of this can be yours. You'll be able to have all of this in your village. And he thought, oh, that's pretty good, that's a good deal, but we've got to convince all of the people to follow him and basically spy on the Japanese. One of the other things that soldiers do, when there's a lot of them together, and they have a bit of R&R, they go down to the local brothel. So these guys took Yali along to the local brothel, and that's where they introduced him to a condom. He'd obviously never seen anything like it before in his life, and he locked that little bit of information away in his brain, and off he went and did a whole pile of other things. This photograph on the left, the Papua New Guinean kneeling down second from the left, the face is a bit brighter in that photograph, that's Yali. That group of soldiers and the Papua New Guineans there, and there's an Indonesian bloke in the middle, they were part of Z Force. They were being dropped off on the coast in what was called Hollandia or Papua, and they were supposed to go and harass the Japanese in there and get intelligence and send it through. Unfortunately, when they landed, they were seen, and all of them but Yali were killed. And Yali spent pretty close to 4 months in the jungle making his way back to Sidor, where he used to live. And he was picked up by another submarine, taken down to Brisbane. He reported on what had happened so that they didn't make the same mistake the next time. And then when he was leaving to go back, again dropping him off by submarine, they said, is there anything we can give you to take back? And they wouldn't give him a Thompson machine gun or anything like that, or a bunch of hand grenades, none of that stuff. He wasn't allowed to take any of that back with him. So he said, oh, I'll have a box of condoms. So he actually took this box of 24 condoms with him. And off he went back to his village in Soar. He then had to go around. Having walked a few 100 miles through the jungles to get back to his village, he was talking to people about what he'd seen in Brisbane, and they were, they were really enamored by all of this stuff that was going to come when they fought the Japanese and beat the Japanese. All of this stuff was going to come to their area. And Yali would say, well, I'm the boss. I'm the one that's going to get this stuff for you. So you go and tell all of your leaders to make their way to my village, because we're going to have a bit of a conference about how we're going to defeat the Japanese. So what Yali had done in the meantime, when he eventually got back to his village, he actually set up little huts, little individual brothels, basically, where he installed his flower girls, or flower Marys. And he had one girl in each of these huts, and he had them all over the place. They were decorated with, again, flowers and everything else. So he would say to these leaders, come on, and we talk about it. And he says, now that you're here, basically he's mirroring what happened to him in Brisbane. Whilst you're here and all the rest of it, you can have some fun. Go into that hut there and a young lady will look after you. Or you go into that hut and that young lady will look after you. So he knew who went into what huts. And he'd instructed the girls in there, when the men went in, was to put a condom on them. And these guys had no idea what was going on. So they accepted the condom. Off they went, enjoyed themselves, and the girls held onto the condom and took the condom, the used condom, to Yali. Yali in that hut there has got a row of bottles with 50-year-old condoms, used condoms, with marks on the bottles, so that he knew exactly who had used that condom. You go back to the Sangoma man and the power that you have over somebody, bit of excreta, up to blood. You got to use condom, you've got the guy by the short and curlies. And that was his power. He got his instant power by saying to these blokes, in pidgin English, me got water belong man. Water belong you stop. Me holding pass. And I've got your sperm in this thing and your water in this thing, and I'm going to hold on to it, and you're going to do exactly what I say. So that was how Yali went through telling everybody about all this stuff and how he actually got the power over all of these leaders. And then they had to then repeat that down the line. When I was in the village, this was Yali's 8th wife, and a young girl there, and she only had one job as far as Yali was concerned, and it's not what you're thinking. Her job was to get a page of the Australian newspaper, which is, the paper is particularly good quality, and the ink, the print that's on there is also very good, and they make the best roll-up cigarettes. So her job every morning was to make Yali a cigarette that was that long. And he would tell you, oh, I only smoke one cigarette a day. But it was that long, the whole width of the Australian newspaper, broadsheet newspaper. And that was her sole job. And when we were talking in the first presentation that I was given 3 wives, one of Yali's wives was given to me when I was in the village there at the time. And I said, thank you, but no thank you. So we've done Sangoma, we've done the customs and all the rest of it, and the cults. Now let's get on to this little subject. You recognize the tune? Anyway. Oh, bit of a hiccup there. Cannibalism. Cannibalism as a means of deriving protein and the like hasn't existed for well over 50 years. Probably 1950s was the very last case of what you would call true cannibalism. Unfortunately for these two gentlemen, And the guy up the top there, James Chalmers, was a Scotsman, and I haven't found anybody in the area that he was eating that could tell me that he tasted like haggis. So, but they went to visit this particular area, preaching the word, and they landed on Easter Sunday, which was in a few days' time. But he had turned up in the village at the most inopportune time to start preaching the gospel, because these people, the men in particular, were going through one of their main sacred ceremonies that they'd been doing for the last 25 or 30,000 years. And it was all related to fertility and food and a whole pile of other bits and pieces. And his little boat went up to the island that they were on. This is where it's situated. We've got Port Moresby way down here, and that's Gairobi is there up there as an island. And they turned up in their little workboat, and one of the villagers paddled out and said, no, don't come, stay away, you can't come. And they said, no, we're here to preach the word of the Lord. And they basically pushed this guy aside and landed. Biggest insult possible. So these guys were all in party mode. So when they knocked him on the head, they cooked him and ate him. So they were that's it. Now, if you remember Punch magazine, and that cartoon I showed you earlier, was the Punch magazine had a cartoon with a couple of missionaries in a cooking pot. It came from that particular incident. Unfortunately, when the word got back to Port Moresby, they sent out a punitive patrol up to the island, and about 25 natives were killed as a result of them killing the two missionaries. And church and state has got some separations, but some of the churches in Papua New Guinea got a lot to answer for. This particular area in Basavi that I was patrolling in, I was called down there. I got a message through the radio. Oh, there's these three men have been performing cannibalism. You've got to come down and arrest them and charge them and send them to jail forever because they're cannibals. So I went down on the patrol into the village. They live in this big house. There could be anywhere from 150 to 300 people living in this house. And I found the three guys. They weren't hiding. And I sat down with them and I investigated exactly what had happened. Now, in Papua New Guinea, a lot of 99% of the villages, they have mortification rites. So when somebody dies, they do certain things with the body. There's one group in the Eastern Highlands, they actually bind the body into the fetal position and they hang them up in like a smokehouse, and they smoke the body. When the body's smoked, they take it down and they go and put it up in the mountains in some caves. So you can actually go there and see all these smoked bodies in caves. One village in the Eastern Highlands, it's unique. It's got the world's most rare disease. It's a disease called kuru, and they've been studied by umpteen scientists to find out what this kuru business is. And what's happened is that, again, over thousands of years, when the person died, to take the power and the significance and the knowledge and everything of that person, they spread it around the village by eating his body, or her body. Now, the brain and the spinal cord and everything was allocated specifically to the women and girls. So they would eat that. Now, we know about mad cow disease, don't we? It's exactly the same. When they're feeding protein made up of reconstituted bovines to cattle, that's how they ended up getting mad cow disease. And that mad cow disease then transferred onto humans. In this particular instance, in Kuru, there's been a genetic alteration, very small genetic alteration, only in the women in the village. So a woman can be perfectly healthy and happy until she hits 85 years of age, and then bang, Kuru hits it, kicks in, and she ends up with this grimace, and it's called a laughing sickness. But it's only in that village, and it's only for women and girls. And I'm not so sure whether it will ever change over time, because it's taken such a long time to get there that it's not going to change again. Back to these guys, these three guys. I was talking to them. I said, okay, what did you do? He said, well, our leader knew that he was going to die. And Papua New Guinea is an amazing place. I was in a coastal village on patrol going through, and all the houses on the coast are elevated for air conditioning. And there's an old lady sitting on a mat under the house. I walked past, what's she doing there? Oh, she'll be dead the day after tomorrow. She's decided that's the end of the game, and she just gives up and dies. And they were all quite happy that she was sitting there, and sure enough, 2 days later, she was dead. This village leader knew that he was going to die. So he got his chosen three and said to them, when I die, for you to get my knowledge, my power, my assets, all of this other stuff that I've got here, I'm passing on to you for mortification rights. You have to consume part of me. So these three blokes said, oh yeah, okay. Well, sure enough, he died. So they cut a little 1-inch cubic piece of flesh from his buttock, put it in the fire, cooked it up, chopped it into three, and had a piece each. And that was them going through the mortification rites that they've been doing in this place for thousands of years. So I got all this information from them. Okay, what am I going to charge these guys with? Interfering with a corpse, cannibalism. Well, there's no cannibalism on the statute books. But under the Queensland Criminal Code, which was the statutes that we administered as patrol officers, I went through it, probably 2 days it took me going through the Queensland Criminal Code just to try and find something to charge them with. And they still had on the statute books up until the year 2000 in the Queensland Criminal Code, witchcraft. It was there, and they only got rid of it in the year 2000. So I charged the three of them with witchcraft, found them guilty, and fined them $4 each. And said, that's it, I'm not interfering with your customs, but whatever you do, guys, if it happens again, don't tell anybody. These three blokes were totally confused about why the missionary was making so much fuss about them doing what they'd been doing for thousands of years. Because this missionary decided that he was going to do this every Sunday. I'll leave that up to you to work that out. But anyway, these three guys, we'd left Papua New Guinea and we were sitting in Adelaide. I was reading the Sunday newspaper, big centre-page spread, 3 cannibals charged and convicted. So these three guys, this missionary had not given up. And it would have been 3 years after I'd convicted them that they were sentenced to jail for 18 months each. And had I known, I would have gone and said, hey, double jeopardy, you can't. They've already been found guilty and charged. But this is about another area of cannibalism, which is for survival reasons. This is Sidor, where that other map that I showed you before, in the middle there. Now, if you can see a word there called Henganofi, underneath Goroka and above Kayapit, where the G is in Henganofi is a place called Shaggy Ridge. And that's where the Australians and the Japanese were on this ridge, and they were both on opposite sides of the ridge, and they're basically just throwing hand grenades over each other on this ridge. And that was the Australians stopping the retreat. Had the Japanese got down over that ridge and then into the Ramu Valley, they would have gotten a clear run down to the coast in a way, but the Australians were stopping them moving through there. So the Japanese had to retreat through where the H is and Huon there, through the mountain areas there. And this is my patrol map. This is the map I drew on the patrol that I went on. You know, when I told you about being in the clouds at 10,000 feet looking down in the villages? Well, this is it. Up on the top is the coast, and along here, where that river is, that's the Yukna River on the right. There's some figures there you may or may not be able to read. But this is the Japanese came through from the bottom right-hand corner of this image up to that central area where the black and the red lines cross each other. That's at 5,500 feet. This is a little bit of video footage of that particular area. Now, the Japanese had come down these mountains, down into the valley, and had to climb up the other side. So this plain's at about 6,000 feet. The village around the corner there is at 5.5, and the village down the bottom there is at about 1,500 feet. So this is the terrain that the Japanese were retreating through. Now, obviously, they were looking for food, and it's not a very highly populated area, so there weren't lots of vegetable gardens for them to raid. But occasionally they'd come across a village and they'd rob the gardens and get some food that way. But this is what they had to, this is the sort of terrain they had to get through. I'll let that run to give you an idea of what was going on. But there's us flying, and the village is actually above the aircraft. The village is up on the top of the ridge there, that ridge as we go through. Inside, the Japanese War Graves Commission came through to basically tick off all of the lost soldiers. And when they arrived, as Morag said, they sat around drinking lots of scotch and everything else. But they sent the message out to the Papua New Guineans in this area: we want to collect the remains of our fallen brothers. We're not interested in Japanese helmets. We're not interested in samurai swords or whatever. What we want is the remains of the soldiers. So they said, every time you bring us some bones or whatever that we can identify as Japanese, we'll pay you for them. There were an awful lot of grannies dug up in that area. They'd wander in with bones galore. And the femur of a Papua New Guinean is probably 3 times fatter than a Japanese, and it might be the same length because they're not a tall race of people, but they're really, really strong. So the main thing they were looking for were phalanges, finger bones and toe bones, which they could get away with by saying, yes, this belonged to Yoshi Harihito or whoever. So they brought they're bringing all these things to this Japanese War Graves Commission. And this is Tep Tep airstrip here. That's the airstrip. You can't go much further than stopping at the top of that one. That's where I spent the 70-day patrol up in that area. So what happened was that on the coast, the War Graves Commission were in there, and they were getting themselves planning on what they wanted to do and everything. So they'd sit around drinking this Johnny Walker Black Label, and inevitably they'd end up getting tanked. These guys would just get drunk just about every night they could. That's the little house that I used to live in when I was up on patrol. And the kitchen was the building behind there. But one of these guys got so drunk, he actually made a complete origami samurai warrior trousers, jacket, and helmet, that big, out of a piece of A5 paper. He was stonkered. He was just sitting there, and he folded this thing. I used to carry it around in my wallet for quite some time until the whole thing disintegrated. But he accompanied me up to that little hut there. So when we were in the hut, people were bringing things to us to show us, bones and the like. But this is this badge was brought by one of the villagers. Now that's a musician's badge. The Japanese, yes, they had their bands, but each of the regiments and the like, anybody that was a competent musician had a badge. And this regiment that was retreating through this particular area, the guy that was with me, his best mate was the musician. So he emotionally was just totally dumbfounded when this badge turned up, because that was his mate, and there was evidence there that they could tick off his mate and draw a line under that, and he could go back to the family and say, yes, we found his remains, blah, blah, blah. This is a Japanese flute. 4 notes, maybe 5, I don't know. But they're not melodious like ours, flutes or saxophones or clarinets or whatever it is. This guy used to sit at 2 o'clock in the morning playing this thing whilst I was trying to get to sleep. After the second night of doing it, because he was doing his mate's spirit and everything else, I radioed back to head office. I said, please send an aeroplane. This guy's got to go back and take his stuff back to Sidor. So this is that area that I showed you when we were flying out. And what I've done is I've reversed the film. So they've come up this ridge, and because somebody would die, they would actually consume the body, the same as the soccer players in the Andes and everybody else. It was a matter of survival. And what happened in this particular area here, they'd gone down, climbed up this ridge, raided the gardens in this little village that we're going to come to, and then they came to a ravine. And in this ravine, there's 7 ladders that went down, bush material ladders that went down, and 7 bush material ladders that went up the other side. And that's called 7-step, that particular location. There wasn't an airstrip there at the time. Only 1 aircraft ever landed on that airstrip, and it's still there. So they robbed the gardens and everything there, and then he got to this ravine. And you can just see and they were heading to that village on the other side. See the ravine here? So anyway, these emaciated Japanese were trying to go down these ladders and up the other side, and a lot of them decided to commit suicide, so they just jump off. Some of them, they were so emaciated, they ran out of energy and fell off these ladders. Some of them got down to the bottom and got up the other side, only to be met by Papua New Guineans with big long bamboo poles, and as soon as the shoulders and chest was above the ground, they pushed them and they'd fall back down into there. The Japanese got over 300 bodies from the bottom of that ravine as the Japanese had gone through. So, but as I say, in that period of time, as they were going through, there's a lot of cannibalism amongst the Japanese soldiers going through at that particular time. So we'll move on to these wigmen in Tari. You saw this picture in early on when we did the Can We Help program. We went back again. Well, this guy here, Hogogo, he was one of the leaders there, and they've got red and black wigs, and these black wigs, like most societies, they have their secret societies. So he's basically the head of the Huli Masonic Lodge with his black wig. The red wigs were a different group of people. But these are some images of, they got these like a panpipe type flute. But we took this photograph just last year in this Huron village in Canada, and that's supposed to be a corpse up there. You know what, you've seen the cowboy movies and everything where they put the bodies up in the what do they call it, hunting grounds or whatever. So that's what they do in India. They wrap them up and put them up there. In Papua New Guinea, they did almost the same thing, but they actually put them in boxes. So that's like a coffin on stilts. And it's on a slant so that when the body decomposes, all the bits and pieces fall out the bottom, and what's left in the box is the skeleton. So this is another one here. One of my jobs from community health was to convince them that they had to bury the dead. That was the safest, cleanest way of disposal of human remains. You have to bury your dead. And they said, certainly, we'll do that. So we tell them to dig a hole and bury the dead. What they did do was they dug a hole that was probably twice as wide as was needed, half as deep as it was needed, and they put the box in the hole and let it do what it was doing in the past. When it had done what it was supposed to do with the decomposition of the body, they just lift the box out of the ground and do what they normally do, stand it on its end. And then they carve the end of it so that dogs and pigs and the like can't actually get into the bones. But you see on the right here, there's a femur here. So all the bones of the deceased are actually in that box. What they do with the heads, or the skulls, they take them and put them around their house. So these are true headstones, basically. So they can tell you who each of those individuals are, and they're all looking out for the well-being of the family. This poor guy on the bottom right here, he'd been coming out of his house, and his enemy was up on the roof with an axe, and as he came out, the axe came down and took off the front of his face, and consequently there's no nasal passages and eye sockets there on the guy on the right there. But that's what they would do in that area. Now, when white people first went into this area, and that would have been the early, probably 1935-ish, the people in this area were not at all scared of the patrol officers, the white people that were going in. Other parts of the country, they saw white people coming, these people took off, their head off. Oh, these ghosts have come to get us, these spirits, bad spirits have come to get us. In this particular area, they didn't do that because their belief system in this area is there's like a parallel universe. So when you die and you go into this other universe and you change colour, you're black in this universe, and in this other universe you're white. Everything's opposite. So when we turn up, they think that we're visiting from that other universe. And so therefore they weren't scared of us. And everything that happens in both universes is exactly the same. So if you get hit with an arrow in this universe, you die. You get hit with an arrow in this universe, you die. If you cross over and you get hit with an arrow, you die. So there was no hesitation in that. So that's why these coffins are left open to allow the spirits to go back and forth between the two universes. This is a modern sarcophagus or mausoleum or whatever. You know the shape of the roof is the same shape as the wig, the red wigs they had. In there is a gentleman by the name of Samathi Abiyui, one of the most powerful men in that area. He was on the Constitutional Planning Committee and somebody that I called a very dear friend. And he passed away whilst we were in Australia, and when we flew up the last time, I went round to pay my respects. I went inside and had a look, and all those windows are louver windows. Inside is the coffin, his clothes, his shoes, food, everything's in there, just like the Norse people, you know, they're going off to Valhalla, but they didn't burn that one down. And this then allows his spirit to move back and forth between these two parallel universes, and it allows him, his spirit, to actually help the future of this particular area. So that's just the way culture happens in Papua New Guinea. I sincerely hope you've learnt something. I think I've got another presentation coming on about amazing cultural differences in Papua New Guinea, but I'm a little bit over time, I think. Anyway, thanks very much indeed for coming along.